that I am recording this, and if you do not want to be recorded, you must get off. So that's just our law, that you must know that you're being recorded. So this is put up on the IMDRC website along with other previous journal clubs, which have been great and have been used, I think, in a number of graduate classes or for students trying to understand a paper that somebody's written. So if you're a member of IMDRC, you can go into the archives and pull out the Zoom recorded session from other articles we've had for about 2.5 years. So, all right, I'd like to welcome everybody again, and I'd like to turn this over to Allie Bryan. Allie, you want to unmute yourself, and I'll mute myself.
All right. Share. Are we good? Can we see? Okay. I'm actually going to kick over to Sally Miedema, who is going to start us off. Sally, you're on mute.
Sorry.
Start that again. Start that again, Sally. Allie, could you just introduce your 3 colleagues first, or your 2 colleagues? Unmute yourself, Allie.
Sorry, I have all the controls and I can't see anything. Sally's going to go ahead and do that.
Oh, okay.
All right, well, welcome everybody to our journal club discussing our paper, You Throw Like a Girl, Young Children's Gender Stereotypes about Object Control Skills. I'm Sally Miedema. I'm a clinical assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. And this project was actually done when I was a doctoral student at USC. And I have my colleagues here, Kelly Lynn Mulvey, who was at the University of South Carolina when we did this project. She's now at North Carolina State University. And then my advisor at the time, who is now our Associate Dean of Research at the University of South Carolina, Allie Bryan. So just to outline our talk today, we're going to give a little bit of background of topics and then go into our methodology, results, and discussion from the paper. The primary focus of our talk today will focus on the discussion, limitations, and future directions, and other related studies that we've done since this publication. So just a brief background for everybody in this audience. I don't really have to spend a whole lot of time discussing the importance of fundamental motor skills. We know that they're the building blocks for more complex movements, and I'm going to quote the great Jane Clark here. And we actually were just discussing this before we hopped on, but we know that fundamental motor skills are not birthday presents. It's not that when you turn 6, you just learn how to jump, or when you turn 7, you learn how to skip. That these skills must be taught, structured, and reinforced. And we also know that the critical time to develop these skills is between the ages of 3 and 7. And there's an absorbent amount of literature that supports that we typically see sex differences in FMS performance, with boys trending to outperform girls even as young as 3 years old. And sometimes not as consistently as boys outperforming girls in object control skills, but girls do sometimes outperform boys in locomotor skills. However, we have really little to no evidence to support this reasoning, especially in young kids. And it's kind of unusual because we know from a physiological perspective, there's no physiological differences between boys and girls prior to puberty. So our study was rooted in social cognitive theory, and Kelly Lynn's going to talk about this in the next few slides. But really, social cognitive theory is just stating that gender socialization occurs both through a process of observational learning and social reinforcement for gender type behaviors.
So when we think about gender development and the understanding that kids develop around their gender and others' gender, There's a lot of evidence that kids are beginning to develop this pretty early on. So by 24 months of age, kiddos are increasingly using gender type vocabulary. They can certainly label others based on gender by 30 months of age. And they're starting to show a lot of preferences early on, and those preferences increase with age. Some of the most common ones are toy and color preferences early on, but this also washes into things like activities, interests, etc. We know that between 26 and 31 months of age, young children begin to verbally identify their gender identity. And this is interesting in that it's the case for kiddos who identify with their gender assigned at birth, as well as for kiddos who identify with a gender different than the one assigned with birth. We also know that gender stereotyping kicks in early. So by 2 years of age, kiddos are holding gender stereotypes, and they hold these stereotypes about a range of different things. So colors, toys, occupations, traits, and activities. These stereotypes are reinforced by socializing agents. So often parents lay the foundation for this very, very early on by color coding the nursery for babies, by selecting very gendered toys for their kids, very gendered clothing for their children, and by socializing them into very gendered activities. So selecting to have a girl begin dance classes early on while a boy begins joining a sports team really early on. These stereotypes are also reinforced by peers and by teachers. And these types of socialization messages are ubiquitous. They're not only hearing these messages from parents, peers, and teachers, but media is also communicating a very, very heavy set of stereotypes around gender. So in movies, books, and TV shows, girls and boys are often gender stereotyped even as young as preschool age. We know that the social construction of gender roles is pretty complex. So kiddos are constantly looking to make sense of their world. They're doing this by constructing what gender roles are around them and what are the gender norms that they should be attending to. And sometimes they're doing this so much that they actually begin to exaggerate differences that might not even be present. So they act in even more gender typed ways than those around them in order to sort of build that gender identity and that in-group identity. We know as well that they construct these concepts because of the stereotypes that are around, and they develop these stereotypes through observation. So for instance, they might observe one peer who is a boy who's interested in football, and then begin to develop the broad generalization that football is for boys, even though they only have 1 or 2 exemplars of that. These conceptualizations begin to shape their behavior. They help them make decisions about whether other kids' behavior is normative or not normative, and they impact what they attend to in their environment. So they're pervasive. Gender roles are constantly playing a role and factoring into the way that kids are making sense of the social world around them. As an example, I just took a quick minute to search on Google Images some of our object control skills and kids, and found some really interesting evidence that might suggest that we need to look more carefully at why these fundamental motor skills differences are emerging and whether it might be rooted in stereotyping. So for instance, if you search throw in kids, almost every image that comes up is of a boy throwing a ball, a football, a balloon, some kind of object to throw. Almost all the images, at least on the first screen, are boys. Similarly, if you type in kick and kids, you see almost all the images that come up are male children kicking balls. And finally, I tried one more. Dribble in kids, we see a really similar pattern. This is not systematic in any way, but I think it gives you the sense that the ways in which kids are seeing and absorbing information around them about who engages in object control skills might be communicating stereotyped messages. So this is really the root of why we got thinking about how gender stereotypes might play a role in perceptions of object control skills, who can, should, and usually engage in these skills.
So given all that we know about children holding stereotypes, we begin to ask our main research questions, which do young kids hold gender stereotypes about certain fundamental motor skills, particularly object control skills? And does this align with the literature about sex differences in performance of FMS? So the purpose of our study was to determine if young children hold stereotypes about certain object control skills. So our participants were 84 children, about equal boys and girls, from a local Head Start center ranging between the ages of 3 and almost 6, with an average of about 4.5 years of age. Our sample was primarily African American, but we did have a pretty good representation of Latino children, and then a few children who were identified as white or other. So with our methods, we use the TGMD2, which this audience knows is a normative and criterion-based motor assessment for kids ages 3 to 10 years and 11 months. We looked at the object control subscale, so dribbling, striking, rolling, kicking, catching, and throwing, and we administered the test according to all manual procedures.
For gender stereotypes, we used the Children's Occupations, Activities, and Traits Assessment. So this is a measure that hasn't been used previously to assess motor skills, but has been used to assess children's gender stereotyping in lots of different domains. It's a self-report questionnaire. It measures awareness of stereotypes, endorsement of stereotypes, and flexibility in thinking about stereotypes. We'll show an example on the next slide. And the preschool version of this measure uses, I'll come back to that in just one second. Let me finish talking to you a little bit about how the measure is structured. The preschool version uses pictures, as you just saw, instead of just words, in order to make sure that kids are really understanding what they're assessing. We modified this measure to capture those same 6 object control skills that Sally just mentioned. So that means that they had 18 questions altogether across these 3 subscales: endorsement, awareness, and flexibility. So what this looked like, if they were completing the assessment for running, they would do a knowledge assessment, who is usually good at running, an endorsement assessment, who should be good at running, and then a flexibility thinking, so who can be good at running. And they have the choice of stereotypically male head, a stereotypically female head, or the 2 heads together to represent both. So children could either point or verbally respond to the assessment. And with the scoring that we settled on was, we wanted to know if they held any stereotypic thinking. We would score that as a 1. So if they said girls only or boys only, that received a score of a 1. And if they said both, then that would be kind of gender inclusive thinking about these fundamental motor skills. So we gave that a score of a 0. So this means that the range for each of these subscales, endorsement, flexibility, and knowledge, was from 0 to 6, and that the lower score reflected less evidence of stereotyping.
So for our procedures, we assessed all children on the TGMD2 using the standardized procedure on the first day. We also video recorded children's performance on the TGMD, and that was scored later by a trained research team. Then on the second day, we assessed all children on the code, and we kind of did this for 2 reasons. One, we wanted them to be familiar with the skills. So when we're asking them, who is usually good at throwing or who is usually good at kicking, that they have seen the skill, they understand the skill, but it's separate from when they're taking the assessment. We read each question to the child. So if Allie, can you switch to the previous slide? So we would say, who is usually good at throwing? And then there was always a male and a female person giving the assessment, and the girl would throw and the boy would, the male would throw and the female would throw, or vice versa. So they could see representation of each person doing that, so it wouldn't be biased. And then they would either say boy, girl, or girl and boy. They could either verbalize it or point to it. We would mark on the sheet which one they identified, and that's how it was scored. Allie, can you move forward? So for our data analysis, we tested for all statistical assumptions and found no violation. We were adequately powered to detect a moderate row value. We collected descriptive statistics for mean and standard deviations by TGMD raw score and the code subscale scores. We also ran independent samples t-test to explore gender differences for flexibility, awareness, and endorsement for object control skills, as well as their actual object performance skills using raw TGMD scores, not standardized TGMD scores, and then did Spearman-Rowe correlation separately for boys and girls to determine the relationship between object control performance and their stereotypes, flexibility, awareness, and endorsement. And this was really done to determine the magnitude of these associations as they differed based on gender. So our results, we found that the boys outperformed girls in object control skills, which is consistent with the literature, but in both the samples, if we looked at those raw scores with girls scoring a 14 and boys scoring a 17, that was relatively low if we would have done the normative reference, so they were both delayed. Also, girls demonstrated a higher prevalence of holding stereotypes than boys in all domains for awareness, flexibility, and endorsement. And if you're asking what that means, so with awareness, if they were asked who is usually good at, who can be good at, or who should be good at, girls typically held the stereotype or significantly held the stereotype more than boys. And then Kelly Lynn's going to talk about our associations with the Spearman-Rowe correlations.
Yeah, so we found some really exciting findings here. We found that for girls, there were significant negative associations with each of these different stereotype components and their object control skill performance. So the more they held the stereotypes, the less well they were performing the object controls skills. However, for boys, we found no significant associations at all. So our girls were holding more stereotypes, and the stereotypes that they were holding were associated with their object control skills, which gives us some evidence that maybe this difference in fundamental motor skill performance between girls and boys could be accounted for by these stereotypes that kiddos are holding even very early on. So if we think about, yeah, go for it. You can jump in, Sally.
Oh, sorry. So in our discussion, we really highlighted that we see a continuation of gender gaps in object control performance between boys and girls, even in early childhood, and that girls were still significantly lower in object control skills than boys. It also further provides evidence for that secular decline in fundamental motor skills in children. And it really speaks to the need for us to start examining non-anthropometric constructs that lead to that despairing gender gap in FMS performance, particularly object control skills. So our initial hypothesis was that boys and girls would hold gender stereotypes regarding object control skills, and that gender stereotypes would correlate with those object control skills. However, is what we found is that girls, really more than boys, were holding those gender stereotypes around object control skills, and that boys really were not holding strong stereotypes. And that for girls, holding those stereotypes was negatively associated with object control skills. So, oh, Kelly Lynn, this is you, sorry. Kelly, then you're on mute. Sorry.
I'm muted. I'm sorry. So these first set of findings examining stereotypes in young children are exciting, but they do align with a lot of literature that looks at stereotypes outside of the motor development field. So a lot of this work focuses on stereotype threats. If you're aware that there's a stereotype out there that your group is going to perform less well in a particular area, the activation of that stereotype can certainly impact your performance. This has been documented in lots and lots of different domains, but one area where we've seen it previously relates to athletic performance. And we find that if girls are thinking about or aware of the stereotype that girls might perform less well in athletics than boys, then that actually does influence their performance. We know that women experience gender stereotype threats, especially when sports are considered more masculine. So this is definitely an area for future research, because we didn't directly measure stereotype threat in the current study, but it may be that even though they were seeing demonstration of these skills by both male and female actors before they completed these tasks, that they may have still had some kind of a stereotype activated, and that the threat of that stereotype was impacting their ability to perform those object control skills. We know that this could be the case because children's awareness of gender stereotypes influences lots of different characteristics about them, and it certainly influences their personal preferences. And we know that as those personal preferences are influenced, their behaviors become more gender stereotypic over time. So if a girl thinks, well, boys are going to be better at throwing and kicking and dribbling than girls will, then they might not engage with throwing and kicking and dribbling type activities, and then may begin to perpetuate those gender stereotypes over time and shy away from activities that require object control skills. So basically, previous literature supports our findings in sort of different domains, and it suggests some future hypotheses that stereotypes certain motor skills might actually lead to differential interest and level of engagement in different motor skill activities. So we found that girls are more aware of and more likely to report gender-based differences in object control skills. This suggests that they might be hypersensitive or hyper-aware of how they compare to their peers more so than boys. So they might be kind of more attuned to this and thinking about, how am I doing and how are my peers doing? And especially, how are my peers who don't share my gender identity doing? This could explain why gender differences and stereotypes typically occur and are held more so for girls than for boys in many domains. So we know so far that understanding the effects of stereotypes at young ages is really important because it has implications for children in later life. And what we don't know yet is whether there can be a direct connection between these early stereotypes, these early deficits in fundamental motor skills, especially object control skills, and then maybe later sports performance. However, we know that the presence of the stereotype within an environment can certainly alter performance. So we need more work that helps us to understand the influences of stereotypes and behaviors together. It may be that these differential behaviors explain why boys were less aware of the gender differences, leading to fewer stereotypes as compared to the girls in our sample.
So while our study had, the strength of being really, this is the first of its kind to explore stereotypes in FMS in young children, and we did have a fairly large sample size. One of the limitations to the study is that we did not examine the sociocultural background of the sample and how that could factor in to the presence of gender stereotypic thinking, particularly among the girls. And what we mean by that is we didn't ask questions like, does your father or your mother play with object control toys with their children? So does your dad or mom play basketball with you? Or does your dad or mom throw the football with you? So we didn't really get that. And then really understand how much exposure these children have to male or female family members playing games like softball, basketball, bowling, any of those object control skills. So for future research, one, we need to kind of examine that sociocultural background of young children and examine the influence not only on FMS performance, but also in their gender stereotypic thinking, and just really explore that impact.
Okay, so yes, we need to explore those environmental and outside factors that are influencing the why. Why is this occurring? But it's also really important now that we know it's existing and it's co-occurring with our object control or ball skill difficulties that are more profound for our young girls. We need to know if we can do something about it, right? So what are these mechanisms that could potentially suppress the presence of these gender stereotypes? Could it be that if we remediate or prevent fundamental motor skill delay, could we also mitigate those gender differences that are present with stereotypes? So because we have the opportunity to present to you a study that we have already published, I can now show you some hot off the press intervention results that if you promise not to tell anyone or act surprised when you see it in the future, I'll go ahead and share them with you. So we did that. We went ahead and followed up in a subsequent year at the same center and ran our motor skill intervention called SKIP, which I think quite a few of you are aware of, the successful kinesthetic instruction for preschoolers. And that's a well-established program that when run over and over again, we can consistently see shifts in motor skill change somewhere in the 1 to 3 standard deviations range. So it tends to have a powerful and profound effect and often closes that gap amongst the boys and the girls with object control skills. So we ran SKIP. We did so in the same center, but with a different sample of kids and tested them again on TGMD2 and the COAT. And this was a 9-week program. So here's our complicated effects. And I hope, I can't really see you all with my screen, so I can see Jane or Kelly Lynn. So if I'm confusing or if you can't see my cursor, just wave at me. So what we have here is our stereotype by group by time plots. The black bar represents the skip condition and the red bar, the control condition. So pre-should, which is our endorsement, versus post-should, you can see our skip kids were successful in reducing their held stereotypes, right? Whereas our control condition remained relatively flat there. For can, which is flexibility, our skip children did reduce their held stereotypes while our control kids actually went up a little bit. So there was an actual interaction here. The usually condition is a little funky, and I don't have a good answer for this one yet. Kelly Lynn and I are going to have to dig into this one to understand why awareness or knowledge actually reduced across condition over the 9-week period. So that's an interesting there. We had a main effect of time, but the interaction wasn't present there. So this graph on the other side here, I think it's your right, represents the overall change. So you can see the endorsement dropped pretty well for the skip kiddos, whereas the control did not change much. But for flexibility, the control kids got a little worse. And then, of course, that drop across condition. So I was really happy that, yes, we had the cross-sectional data that showed we had that co-occurrence, and we were actually able, at least in these initial findings, to do something about it. So remember, act surprised. If you're the reviewer, think of us kindly. And so to break it down a little further, of course, we saw in the cross-sectional study, in the original descriptive piece, that it was the girls holding the stereotypes more prevalently. But in this study, that wasn't the case. We actually had a mix where the boys and the girls both were doing it. So, however, the intervention, if you break it down by girls by group, so skip versus control girls, usually was not significant, right? Because again, both the experimental and the control girls reduced that stereotype as well as the boys. So that was not significant. But can and should, which is our flexibility and endorsement, that's where the significance hit, was for the girls. We were able to significantly reduce skip girls compared to control girls with flexibility and endorsement. Whereas our boys, although they went down, it wasn't significant, but it could be that skip was protective of the girls and that it was the control girls who were actually increasing their held stereotypes for flexibility and for endorsement at the end of the 9 weeks. So interesting, wacky findings here. And we have one more fun piece. This one's actually in press in a journal called Sex Rules. So you can check this one out. We also wanted to see, and I'm going to let Kelly Lynn explain the why here in a minute, but in this study, again, running the SKIP program, we were interested in seeing if we could foster or facilitate these gender integrated friendships. And table 1 over here shows that at baseline to post test, we saw a pretty good jump in gender integrated friendships for our SKIP girls, whereas our control girls went down and our SKIP boys went up. Our control remained relatively constant. So Kelly Lynn, if you want to explain more, go for it.
Yeah, so we were interested in this because we felt like perhaps why some of these kind of gender stereotypes are kicking in and are so strong in preschool is because kids are primarily gender segregating. So girls tend to hang out with girls in the preschool period, boys tend to hang out with boys, and actually this kind of maintains throughout elementary school, and it really isn't until middle school, early adolescence that we start to see a little bit more gender integration and friendships. We know the importance of gender integration, though, because that intergroup contact, that opportunity to be friends with and interact with peers who share your gender identity, as well as peers who don't share your gender identity, can really help to reduce stereotypes. It can help you to see that there's a range of interests among my friend group, regardless of if they share my gender identity or if they don't. We might have an interest in common in, you know, we both like to play baseball together, or we both like to play Minecraft together, or whatever it happens to be. And we really weren't sure whether SKIP would increase gender integrated friendships, but we felt like it might because the structure of SKIP really fosters cooperation, collaboration, and that equal opportunity to see both of your peers as competent and capable in all of these skills. So it lines up really well with intergroup contact theory that if you have authority support for intergroup contact, then you're likely to see improvements both in attitudes towards the out group as well as in actual friendships develop and positive interactions between the out group. And Skip did just that. So we see after a fairly short period of time, a really nice increase in kids who say, hey, I have friends who are both girls and boys, which was a really exciting finding and suggests that we're finding these really clear motor development benefits for Skip, but we're also finding a lot of other social emotional benefits that can have cascading effects for these kiddos as they move through school and through life.
So another what's next. So then since we gave you the preview and the bonus coverage, we figured we'd tell you what else we're looking into playing around with down the line. So of course, we want to take a look at what are these other social constructs that are related to motor skill development and what are the factors driving gender stereotypes. But I think what's most interesting for me is if we go back and retain or we explore the children longitudinally, are these findings holding? We know that there's enough, at least cross-sectional and a little bit of longitudinal work that shows if you learn motor skills, and learning can't be technically undone, so they tend to retain for the most part. But what about these social constructs? So that's something we're taking a look at and exploring. But then what's really exciting, and again, don't tell too much, how are these changes in motor and changes in social emotional constructs having that cascading effect that Lynn referred to? What are they doing down the line? Are they spilling over into school readiness or other elements or attributes of a child's life? So more to come. Stay tuned. Hopefully we can come back and present those data. So here's our plug for the DCD IMDRC conference and I see Matt Chu's on the call. So hopefully you'll appreciate this for call for submissions for that wonderful conference that is being held at University of Ghent, and they're the host institution. February 5th is the deadline. And you will find out by the end of February so that you can register in March. And I will hand over to Sally for all of us. Any questions?
Yes, thank
Okay,
you all for attending our chat, and at this time we will open it up for any questions.
So I'm going to start with a question, just a little bit of a discussion. I don't think you really told us about the Skip intervention as to whether you had the same ethnic group that you had in the second study.
Yep, it was the same urban Head Start center and relatively similar ethnic dispersion. Yep.
So I know you've probably already done this, but have you looked at the difference between a urban, mostly African-American preschool versus a sort of more suburban, more integrated or more white community, and whether those stereotypes are the strong, maybe Kelly knows this, whether they're stronger within other ethnic groups, Latino, African-American, white?
It's a great question, and it's a complicated question because
I'm sure.
You muted.
You hit your mute. You're muting again.
Still muted.
well, you think I know how to use Zoom after all this time.
Keep
Not
your hand
there
off
yet.
that keyboard.
Exactly. Hands are here. There are absolutely some cultural norms that come into play here. So for instance, Latino culture is an interesting one because there are often even stronger gender norms and stereotypes. I think we need to do a whole lot more research. I think your question about urban environments versus more rural environments is also really interesting and probably intersects completely with ethnicity because kiddos, I'm a kiddo who grew up in a rural environment, and you engage in more object control skills because you're like helping out on the farmland, right? So you have to begin doing some of those skills earlier on, and you might not see as much gender differentiation helping out with the family.
Well,
on the other hand,
yeah,
go for it.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Basically, my answer is we don't have the data yet, and I think there's more to do there. But I think the relationships that Allie has fostered with schools in South Carolina will enable us down the line to get there because she's getting the opportunity to work with kids in lots of diverse settings and with kids from lots and lots of different ethnic backgrounds. So I would say more to come.
So I see a chat comment and Latu is asking a question, but I want to follow up that just one more point. When I was working in Pittsburgh, I was involved in a Title I project. So I went into all the daycares. And what I noticed was that in most of these daycare preschool centers, the teachers were primarily African-American women who were very interested in doing dancing activities, but themselves personally were not people who liked object projection kinds of things. So there weren't a lot of ball skills. There wasn't a lot of, in fact, there wasn't much space to do ball skill kinds of things, but they did a lot of dancing and balance activities, but it was really the influence of those people as role models, not just their parents. And there are not many men who work in daycare centers or preschools either.
I think those are great questions. And I think I see Allie nodding her head. I think you find similar things, though honestly now like Go Noodle and all of the movement-based programs I think are ubiquitous, and they are mostly locomotor skills. They're not necessarily object control skills. At least my kids are teenagers now. At least when my kids were in that preschool elementary age, most of those programs were focused on locomotor.
Okay, so first we'll let Matu talk, and then I have a question in the chat from Ryan Sacco. Matu?
Thank you, Jane. Good evening, Ali, Kelly, and Sally. I like this type of research. It's quite new from my perspective, but I think it's a very interesting issue, of which the nature of the differences you observe is certainly multifactorial, if I may say so. I admit I have not read the full paper, so I would like to ask you two questions. The first one is, you in your research, you scored children that respond without any bias towards stereotype in the direction of 0, and the other ones in the direction of 1. But you did not discriminate between, do they say that the boys are better or the girls? This was the first thing that came to mind. Don't you, I feel that you might miss some information, or is that information that you would have if you would, for example, score from 1 for the girls, 0, no stereotypes, and -1 for systematically biased towards girls? Or am I missing something?
Kelly, Lynn, and I have been digging into these data quite a bit, and we have that information. It's actually we're struggling with how to best present it. It's because it's very complicated in a cogent, coherent way.
Yeah, I think for this first paper, we were really interested in the equitable responses. Like we were very interested in kids who say anyone can do these skills. But I think you're absolutely right that to follow on this, we want really large samples where we can dig a lot more carefully into understanding those patterns, broader age ranges, and then I think the -1, 0, 1 scoring would be excellent. The pattern is though complicated because we've got 6 object control skills and we've got 3 different domains. So it becomes a lot of data. So yeah, for simplicity's sake, we went with the 0, 1 this time, but I do think that it would be fascinating to dig in a little bit more.
So just to piggyback off that, we do have the raw data for what they did identify that we can dig into later. But like I said, or like Kelly, Lynn, and Allie said, when we started digging into the data, it really became quite messy. And so we wanted to establish this first before we even dug into the others. So we do have those true responses that we can go back to later. But for the purpose of this study, that was how we thought the data was best captured to answer the specific research question.
So if I could ask Allie to change us out of slideshow mode, and I would like to ask Ryan if he would ask his question in person rather than because he asks a very long question in the chat. So if you don't mind. And by the way, Matu, it's the afternoon on the East Coast, and David, it's I think morning for him, almost just noon. So yeah, you're having a glass of wine. Thank you.
At the end of the day in Belgium. Sorry.
and good for you, I say. Of course, it's 5 o'clock someplace all the time, so we could all drink. So Ryan, if you would jump in here.
I can give this a try, but I got 2 little ones screaming in the background, so we'll see what we got. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm a huge fan of the 3 of you and your work. You guys hopefully know that already. Understanding that it may not have been collected at any point or available retrospectively, what, if any, insight could you provide regarding the interaction of the number of gender and gender identity of siblings I also ask about parental figures, and I also ask about teachers. And I know for the first study, you touched on potentially not having that, but then with the secondary study, I'm curious if you got into any of that at all. Thank you so much, y'all rock.
Who wants to answer here? Do you want to go ahead, Sally, or?
I can go ahead. So Ryan, I'm gonna flash back your memory for a moment. So for those of you that don't know, Ryan and I used to share an office, and I remember during the study us talking about that. So in the future studies, we do not have any sibling data for the reference in both of these studies for the intervention piece and for this association's paper. All of the teachers were female and they were African American at the center. But I think that also sheds light, because during the intervention, the teachers are out there and they're seeing them, and you go to recess, so they're seeing teachers do these things, and looking at gender identity and ethnicity of that would factor in. But to answer your question, no, we did not get any of those parental factors or sibling factors. We do know within the center who had siblings at the center, but that's the only data that we have. It could expand beyond, unless they were at that particular center. So once again, a lot of stuff that we have to dig into, and then also with the IRB and just parental involvement in surveys and stuff. Everybody knows how that works.
I think when we conceptualize this, and it feels like 100 years ago, doesn't it, Kelly Lynn? But I don't think it was that long ago. We did not even think about the opportunity to capture the sibling and the parent data, and we absolutely should have. And so that would definitely be in our next step. So thank you, Ryan, for that comment. The other thing I want to touch upon, and Kelly Lynn, if you want to jump in on this, that'd be great, is the notion of gender identity and the fact that we did use, the boy-girl questioning. I don't know that we would do that again. So Kelly Lynn, if you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, it's a challenge, because we want to capture the gender stereotypes that might be present. But increasingly, our kiddos, even at very early ages, are recognizing that gender is not a binary, and that their peers and themselves as individuals might not identify as only male or only female. So I think we need some measure development work, especially with these very traditional gender stereotype measures, where we're giving them, a head of a girl with pigtails and a boy with a very traditional masculine haircut. We've got work to do to think about how can we revise this measure to better capture gender as as not just a binary. I think the
wow,
the
and you're in the
is
South.
still good. It's hard.
Yeah.
I wanted to follow up on a question I asked before we all started, and that was on whether or not you looked at the children's perception of their competence. In other words, do I feel, what I throw like and how I feel like I throw, that sort of relate with their perception of gender stereotyping. I know that this is one of those unpolished piece of data that you have already, because they answered that question for me before, but I thought I'd throw it out there again.
Sure, I can answer it. We have those data. We try to collect, as much as we can, and darn it if we didn't miss the opportunity to collect sibling and parent data. But yes, we have the perceived competence, both with Lisa Barnett's scale that's aligned with TGMD, as well as Susan Harder's that's more global. And all of them were, as you can probably guess, some of you, that they were all pretty high. So across the board.
So it didn't discriminate then.
No, but what was interesting, and I don't even know if these two know this yet, the intervention actually caused them to have a lower self-perception a little bit. And my guess,
how about a more accurate perception rather than
my guess is that they became more aware. So
they overestimate their ability. I can do everything, to this is what I can do, which is, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's that whole effort versus competence. I try and therefore I'm good. And I would even go as far as, okay, you're good at shoe tying, show me. And they would shake their head and go, no, you do it. So it's like they think they can, but they weren't putting two and two together, if that makes sense. It made me think that was the effort logic.
So I was going to say that when I was growing up, I would always thought it as a compliment, as somebody would say to me, "You throw like a boy." So, I mean, it was just sort of a reverse of that, but it's like, even then when we were growing up as kids, it was thought of as, you know, boys throw better than girls. However, I did want to push you on this cross-cultural work, because in Brazil, where everyone is a kicker, not a thrower, you know, you could look at something like that and see whether or not these things held up, because I'm sure Nadia Valentini would love to do that study with you. But someone that's Brazilian might want to do something where there's such a stereotype for boys do kicking, as in football, as you would call, as Matu would call, we would call soccer, versus throwing. This is how they throw. It's to throw the ball back in the game, rather than what we would call a sort of baseball pitch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
I agree.
Yeah, it'd be kind of interesting to see if that your ideas held up cross-culturally that way.
I think
Because you have a cross-cultural, you have the cross-cultural within the United States as it is, but really when it's embedded in a culture that doesn't value throwing as much as we do.
I was going to say, I think that's why the coding for male and female separately gets complicated, because I don't know that every single object control skill is going to have exactly the same stereotypes. And I think your example of how that could be culturally bound as well is a really, really good exemplar of that we need to really closely examine what is the skill, what is the context, and what is the stereotype held for adults, and then is that the same as for kiddos or not?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so does the Staden group or the University of Michigan group have any questions out there in the world?
Jane, I actually have a question.
Okay, let's get to David Staden.
Actually, it's more of a comment, and it piggybacks on your suggestions for future research. So first of all, I was going to say, Ali and Kelly and Sally, I love the study. Great presentation too. I noticed in your paper that you cited the Garcia paper from '94 that looked at gender differences in preschoolers' interactions when they're learning fundamental motor skills. And from memory, she reported that there were quite big differences in how boys and girls interacted with each other when they were learning skills. So the boys tended to be more egocentric and competitive and individualized, and the girls tended to be more cooperative and more likely to share equipment. And so she had argued that one of the contributing factors to the differences in boys and girls' fundamental motor skills was the boys got more practice. So particularly when it came to tasks that involved equipment like balls, because, you know, the boys just grabbed the equipment and they went, you know, they played with it and practiced, and the girls were more likely to share it. And she also noticed, and this is consistent with Jane's idea that there might be cross-cultural differences in some of this, that the Asian children that were in the sample tended to be more cooperative in sharing, regardless of whether they were boys and girls. So I'm just curious how you might then bring that information into the future work that you're planning to do too.
Well, I'm laughing because
me too. Because we're talking about
we had it. Sally had it up to discuss, and Kelly, Lynn, I'm going to quote you, and you can go ahead and talk. She goes, "We're not putting that up there. That's a gender stereotype in and of itself."
I had a whole slide in the discussion where I was going to talk about this, David, with the Garcia paper, and Kelly Lynn was like cringing
adamantly against it. So the reason why though is because that paper's from 1994, and I think our norms have changed, but that means we need to replicate it, right? Like we need to really do some observational work. And actually, we tried to do that. Remember those GoPros that we had mounted on the Valley? We haven't finished coding.
Yeah, so I was going to speak to that. So, for all of you Michigan and South Carolina people, when I was a doctoral student, I think if I wanted to study everything that I was wanted to study, I would have been there 20 years. But we actually have some data where we stuck GoPros on the kids' heads and filmed them in recess and in the intervention when we were doing the intervention paper to try to measure their interactions. And let me tell you, if anybody has that idea, please don't do it, because when you go to code the data, one, you will throw up, because if you ever see how many times a preschooler moves their head or talk, it will make you nauseous. But two, it was just we had aerial cameras and all these things, but David, to your point, we were looking at, from the Garcia and Garcia paper, not only what they did, but also in the type of feedback that people leading the intervention. Was it, there's the data that speaks to, for boys, it's more for performance, and girls typically are given feedback towards effort. So like, oh, you tried at throwing, good job, versus, a different feedback. So we had tried to examine that from the Garcia and Garcia paper and replicate it and kind of bring it into this century, because Kelly Lynn really had a lot of issues with that paper. So we tried to capture that. And I think through the skip intervention paper, we were very cognizant of the feedback that was given, of the structure type, of the opportunities, not only during the intervention sessions, but when they were at recess and promoting that. It was just very hard to capture.
Well, it sounds too like skip might attenuate some of these differences too, just because of the way in which you implement it. So, but thanks for bringing me up to date on where things stand with that Garcia paper. I know it's old, but I don't know this
so
area.
Also is the
well.
intersection with attribution theory, which is, I think, very interesting also. Okay, Stodden's group. I know this is the third time she's leaned forward. You can now speak, unmute yourself in Stodden. There you go.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask if there was an age effect within your sample in regards to the gender stereotypes.
Nope.
No,
No, I was surprised by that.
Yeah.
We had a pretty decent age range, but no.
Okay. And then my second question is, I don't know if you mentioned this in your PowerPoint, but did you examine like differences between anthropometrics between males and females?
Other than height and weight, which is not really what you're asking, no, we didn't have like seated height or limb length, or we just, neither one of those should have type.
About the same between males and females?
Yeah, we don't know. We assume so.
Yeah, at that age, you don't see such separation.
No, not
as you
till
would
puberty.
And yeah, exactly, not till puberty. Michigan, University of Michigan, by the way, that Garcia paper was from Michigan State. Just a little competition there. Any questions from Michigan?
I don't think so. I think it's a really great paper. And we're looking forward to the future papers that are to come. But thank you, Allie, for giving us, the insider scoop.
Wink, wink. You didn't see it.
Does the Stodden group have another question? There's a person leaning into the screen. Yes.
Hey, great job, everyone. Just wanted to ask a question. I think we know that there's very similar anthropometric measures between males and females, but do you suggest that we are participating in all physical activities and sports, males, females, and any gender identity early in these years?
I'm trying to think about your question here. Are you asking, are we suggesting that all children be able to participate in sports? Is that the question?
Yes, together, regardless of gender identity.
They're not,
together,
girls soccer
and not girls soccer, nor boys soccer, or other sports at that age group.
Well, I don't know how my group here would feel, but from a developmental and a former coaching perspective, my position would be to put children where they are developmentally.
Yeah.
And to forget, boys, girls, or it just, low level, middle level, high level.
Yeah, I would agree completely, so that they're with peers who are performing at a similar level and able to be competitive with those peers.
But you only get better by competing against people who are just a little higher than you are.
Yeah, so in that developmental.
So just a little challenge. Yeah, really. Yeah. I know it's the challenge of teaching, really, of how to put your children together in a class so that you challenge them, but don't frustrate them that they can't do as well as other children. So, and finding the things they're good at. Somebody's going to be your goalie.
Oh, that would have been.
Everybody's going to be a good, or somebody's going to be a good catcher. Well, this has been very interesting. I don't see anybody else with chat things. I want to remind everyone that our next, well, first I should thank our presenters. I think they've not only given us something to think about, yes, but also they've done something that I think is you get uniquely in Journal Club, which is you get insights into the challenges of doing research and the kinds of decisions you have to make, and the data that you might collect that you haven't analyzed, or the data that you should have collected but didn't think about, or people wouldn't let you do when you were a graduate student. So I think there's lots to be learned here that you kind of open up the window of what is research like, and how did that paper get into I would ask, how many times did you go around on the review on this? Because remember, our last session before Christmas was on peer reviewing. Was it reviewed? It was not accepted the first time in, right?
Oh, no.
Good.
No,
Yeah,
and
that's important for all
because-
students to know.
Yeah, it's
Look at
the
submission date. Look at
to
the
do the
submission date.
individual skills.
Yeah, so, sorry.
Say that again. There were three of you talking.
I was saying because we tried to do the individual at first, and reviewers were like, "This is too complicated. We need a simpler story here." But yeah, as
Let me
Sally said, look at the
translate for
submission date
Kelly
and
Lynn.
publication date.
Because you froze there. So what she was trying to say is we tried to do the by gender discrimination, and the reviewers had a hard time with it. And they were going to reject it. And we said, okay, let us try.
Okay, we'll get that out of there.
Yeah. And it probably went through, gosh, 5 rounds. I mean, it was definitely one of the papers I've had revised and reviewed the most out of anything I've ever.
There's a moral to that story for all of you graduate students or young puppies that haven't published very much. So yeah, and if you haven't gone back and looked at last month's, was it last month? So long ago, when did we do that, David? In October, November, when we did how to review a manuscript, which is also on the website.
I think it was December, wasn't it? Wasn't
December,
it? Was
yeah, probably
the last one
yeah.
of the year that we did.
And
But
for
I
all
was
of
just
you,
going to add that the problem you have with the review is the problem you have when you do something new and unique. It's like people are like, oh, what do we do with this?
yeah, exactly.
Pretty much.
And it's new for you, and it's new for the reviewers, and also it's the challenge for the editor to find the reviewer that really can read this and understand it. And often you might get somebody who is a social psych person and a motor development person or a social emotional person, and they're like getting a different view of it. And then they drive you crazy with their comments because one wants you to go this way and the other one wants you to go that way, right?
That did happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was not the editor on that. And I don't think Matu was, probably not David, because it was Research Quarterly, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Okay. All right. So that brings me to my last kind of comments. First, besides thank you, is the paper. This will be recorded in case you want to come back and look at it. Secondly, on February 15th, Jill Zwicker is going to be talking to us on a this sort of fits in with the DCD and IMDRC meeting. Jill's talking motor impairments in children with autism spectrum disorder, a systematic review and meta-analysis with she and her colleagues. So she'll be presenting in February, but we don't have anyone for March. So if anybody has a suggested new article, we're always looking for articles, and this would be 2023. 2024 would be like, wow. But any articles that you want, just suggest to David and to Haley, and I are the kind of coordinating committee for this, but we'll take any suggestions of papers that and they have to be a member of IMDRC, or one of the authors must be. Okay. And if you haven't been to the website, it's i-mdrc.com. Okay. Ryan, we really need to get rid of that hyphen. No, I know we can't. All right. Again, many thanks to everyone, and have a good Thursday night. We're going to get there, Matu. I'm going to get to my glass of wine also, and have a good weekend. Take care.
Thank you, everyone, for inviting us. It was a pleasure.
It was great.